All right, today you only have one question, and that question is about comparing unit rates. Now, just because it's one question doesn't mean that it's going to be really quick and simple. It actually is a little more complex, especially when you see mixed numbers and fractions. So I created a problem that's very similar so that hopefully it would help you get through this question independently. So comparing unit rates, that implies that first, we're going to have to find the unit rate. Okay, and remember unit rate is the same as K, which is Y divided by X. So let's look at the question. The cookie recipe below makes 3 dozen, and I'm implying cookies. Determine the amount of each ingredient needed to make 5 dozen cookies. So each of these is going to make 3 dozen. But our overall goal is to figure out how much of each ingredient do I need to make not just 3 dozen, but 5 dozen. So in order to figure that out, I want to find the amount of each ingredient that it would actually take to make 1 dozen. If I find out how much of these ingredients I need to make 1 dozen, could I find out how much I need for 5 dozen? Yes. All I would need to do is multiply the 1 dozen by 5. But right now we know that each of these ingredients is for 3 dozen. So what I need to do is first figure out the unit rate, how much of these ingredients would be for 1 dozen, and then I would simply multiply it by 5. So let's start with this 2.5 cups of sugar for 3 dozen. Now, in my opinion, it would be easy to make a table out of this information. I'm a little short on room, so I'm just going to identify the X and the Y. So my X and my Y. Again, it comes down to our independent variable and our dependent variable. I'm going to write that down real quick. Sometimes it can be hard to figure out which one's the Y, which one's the X. I actually like to start with the Y dependent. So I think which of these is dependent on the other. The amount of sugar we need depends on how many dozen we make. So this would become my Y, my 3 dozen would be my X. And I can also think about it, okay, if 2.5 cups of sugar makes 3 dozen, and I want to figure out what would it be for 1 dozen, I would take this number and divide by 3. And we know that to find our unit rate, we have to take our number, Y, and divide it by X. So if this is the number I want to divide by 3, that means this is my Y and this is my X. Now, right now my calculator is being used by my phone. And so I am going to have to do this by hand. And this is really good because we haven't practiced dividing fractions and mixed numbers in a while. So this will be good practice. So I'm going to take 2.5 and divide it by 3. So when I take 2.5 divided by 3, this is a mixed number that I need to convert to an improper fraction. So I'm going to take my whole number, 2, multiply it by the denominator. 2 times 2 is 4, plus my numerator is 5, and then I keep this 2 the same. So 2.5 is the same thing as 5 halves, or 5 over 2. So 5 over 2 divided by 3. I know that 3 as a whole number is the same thing as 3 over 1. So now I have 5 over 2 divided by 3 over 1. And hopefully you remember that when we divide fractions, we keep the first fraction. We change this division into multiplication. And then we flip the second fraction. So 3 over 1 becomes 1 over 3. So it's a little messy. We have 5 over 2 times, we flip 3 over 1 to 1 over 3. This becomes 5 times 1 is 5. 2 times 3 is 6. So in order to make 1 dozen cookies, I would need 5/6 cup of sugar. So let's see, I'm just gonna write this. I'll just write it down here. Bear with me because I don't have a ton of space. 5/6 cup of sugar would be for 1 dozen cookies. I'm going to do the same thing for each one. So 4 1/4 cups of flour makes 3 dozen. What would it be for 1 dozen? Well, I have to take this number and divide it by 3, or my y, and divide it by my x. So now I have 4 1/4 divided by 3. Same thing, I need to convert this mixed number into an improper fraction. 4 times 4 is 16, plus 1 is 17 over 4 divided by 3. And 3 is the same as 3 over 1, so I will keep it in fraction form. In order to divide these fractions, I'm going to keep the first fraction, change the division to multiplication, and then flip the second fraction. So that would be 17 over 4 times, not 3 over 1, but 1 over 3. Again, sorry, it's a little messy. 17 over 4 times 1 over 3. 17 times 1 is 17. 4 times 3 is 12. Now this has given me an improper fraction. I do need to convert this back into a mixed number. 17 over 12 is the same thing as 17 divided by 12. So if I take 17 and divide it by 12, 12 goes into 17 one time. 1 times 12 is 12. I subtract, get a remainder of 5 twelfths. So this comes out to 1 5/12. So 1 5/12 cups of flour would make 1 dozen. Now these are kind of odd amounts for cooking, but we're just practicing this for mathematical reasons. So that would be 1 dozen. This next one is thankfully pretty easy. If we had 3 eggs, that would make 3 dozen. So what would that be for 1 dozen? Well, we still take our y and divide it by our x. 3 divided by 3 is 1. So 1 egg for 1 dozen. Am I finished? No. I just found out the ingredients that will give me 1 dozen, but remember my question says determine the amount of each ingredient needed to make 5 dozen. So if these are my ingredients to make 1 dozen, if I want to figure out what 5 dozen would be, I would simply multiply all these numbers by 5. So I'm going to take a little bit of Thursday's space. Let's start with our sugar. 5/6 times 5, or 5 over 1. 5 times 5 is 25. 25, 6 times 1 is 6, so 25 over 6. I need to convert that back into a mixed number. 25 over 6 is the same thing as saying 25 divided by 6. 6 goes into 25 4 times. 4 times 6 is 24. I subtract and get 1. So my whole number is 4 and 1/6. So I would need 4 1/6 cups of sugar. And that would make 5 dozen. Let's do the same thing for our flour. So if 1 5/12 cups of flour makes 1 dozen, to figure out for 5 dozen, I'd multiply this number by 5. 1 5/12. Remember, 1 5/12 was the same thing as 17 over 12. We just converted it. So 1 5/12, 17 over 12, that's the same number, improper fraction, mixed number. So I'm going to use the improper fraction version, 17 over 12, and that's for 1 dozen, so I want to multiply it by 5. 17 times 5 is 35, is 85. So this is going to be 85 over 12. Now, if I said, oh yeah, you're going to make cookies and you're going to need 85 12 cups of flour, that doesn't really make sense to us. So that's why we convert it back into a mixed number. So 85 over 12 is the same thing as doing 85 divided by 12. 12 goes into 85. I believe, does it go 72? I believe it goes in 7 times. 7 times 2 is 14. Okay, with a remainder of 1. So 7 and 1/12, and that would be cups of flour, would make, ooh, this balloon's getting messy over here. That's okay, math can be messy. So we have 4 and 1/6 cups sugar makes 5 dozen. 7 and 1/12 cup flour would make 5 dozen. And then last but not least, we have 1 egg for 1 dozen. So if we're doing 5 dozen, we'd multiply that by 5, easy peasy. We would need 5 eggs for 5 dozen. Now, seems like a lot of work. A lot of that is just converting fractions to multiplying and dividing fractions, improper fractions, mixed numbers. But in comparing unit rates, the most important thing is to find the rate of 1, like we did here. We said, okay, if this is the ingredients for 3 dozen, let's figure out what it would be for 1 dozen. Then we can easily multiply that by 5. Maybe not easily, but with some work, we can multiply by 5. Whew, long video. Hope you hung in there okay.